Section 2 of Israel and Hamas Conflict in Brief by Jim Zanotti and Jeremy M. Sharp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. U.S. Policy. Israeli Military Operations. The U.S. government has stated its support for military operations by Israel to defend itself in line with international law, including in Gaza. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and other administration officials have visited Israel and other countries in the region since the outbreak of conflict. U.S. officials have publicly opposed calls for an indefinite ceasefire, citing Israel's right to defend itself. Nevertheless, U.S. officials have voiced support for humanitarian pauses and additional hostage prisoner exchanges. While President Biden appears to broadly support Israel's stated objectives of ending Hamas rule in Gaza, he and administration officials have sought to convince their Israeli counterparts to take steps to minimize casualties, reduce the intensity of their operations, and step up humanitarian aid. In early January, a National Security Council spokesperson said the Israeli goal of degrading Hamas's ability to carry out attacks inside Israel is attainable, but it is unlikely that Israel can eliminate the group and its ideology. Potential post-conflict scenarios. The administration has been conferring with Israeli and Palestinian Authority officials on security and governance for Gaza after conflict ends or abates. Tensions between supporting domestically legitimate Palestinian self-rule and safeguarding Israel's capacity to monitor and stifle potential threats may intensify the challenges involved. In November, President Biden articulated the following principles. Quote, "To start, Gaza must never again be used as a platform for terrorism. There must be no forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, no reoccupation, no siege or blockade, and no reduction in territory. As we strive for peace, Gaza and the West Bank should be reunited under a single governance structure, ultimately under a revitalized Palestinian Authority, as we all work toward a two-state solution. The international community must commit resources to support the people of Gaza in the immediate aftermath of this crisis, including interim security measures, and establish a reconstruction mechanism to sustainably meet Gaza's long-term needs." End quote. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has indicated that the Palestinian Authority would only govern Gaza, which Hamas forcibly seized from the Palestinian Authority in 2007, in the context of significant progress toward establishing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, with a capital in East Jerusalem. Secretary Blinken has indicated that such progress is unlikely to be easy or, quote, happen overnight, end quote, and reportedly has tasked the State Department to evaluate options for implementing a two-state solution, with U.S. recognition of a Palestinian state as one possibility, quote, in a way that assures security for Israel, end quote. U.S. and Palestinian Authority officials have reportedly discussed possible mechanisms for improving Palestinian Authority leadership and domestic legitimacy. Some leading Palestinian figures argue that the Palestinian Authority cannot be strengthened via reforms without Israel granting it greater control over its revenues and security. Prime Minister Netanyahu has insisted that only Israel can demilitarize Gaza and openly opposes the Palestinian Authority returning, purportedly because of rhetorical and financial support he argues the Palestinian Authority provides for terrorism. In January, after President Biden reiterated his commitment to an eventual two-state solution, Netanyahu pledged to continue insisting that Israel have full security control of, quote, all territory west of the Jordan River, end quote, and said that this stance has prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu may calculate that opposition to a two-state solution and Palestinian Authority rule of Gaza might rally domestic support for him and the ultra-nationalist figures in his government. The significant dip in Netanyahu's public approval ratings since the October 7th attack could lead to his government's collapse and new Knesset elections sometime in 2024. Prospects for any Hamas role in post-conflict Palestinian Authority governance, which some leading Palestinian Authority figures appear to be discussing, would likely encounter U.S. and Israeli opposition. Major U.S. policy issues related to post-conflict scenarios in Gaza would include the following: resolving potential differences between U.S., Israeli, and Palestinian Authority officials. It is unclear whether or not the parties can move from the starting points discussed above to compromises on aspects of post-conflict governance and security. Role of Palestinian Authority security forces. Reportedly, quote, U.S. and Palestinian officials have discussed a plan to retrain 1,000 former Palestinian Authority security forces officers in Gaza and a further 3,000 to 5,000 in the West Bank who would work in Gaza after the war, end quote, with training presumably under the auspices of the U.S. Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority, USSC. Arab states his role. Egypt, Jordan, and Arab Gulf states may be reluctant to help transition Gaza by contributing troops, advisors, or funding toward Palestinian Authority self-rule or help with reconstruction, if doing so might be perceived domestically and internationally as enabling indefinite Israeli occupation. Thus, Arab state participation may depend on diplomatic progress toward Palestinian statehood. U.S. military deployments. Since October 7th, President Biden has positioned additional U.S. military assets and personnel to the Middle East in an apparent effort to support Israel and Arab partners, deter Iran and Iranian-supported groups from widening the war, and prepare for contingencies such as an evacuation of U.S. citizens. As of early February 2024, the guided missile destroyers USS Carney and USS Gravely were positioned in the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea, where U.S. warships have been regularly intercepting Houthi missiles. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group was positioned in the Red Sea, and the USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group ARG was positioned in the eastern Mediterranean. U.S. expedited arms deliveries to Israel. Since October 7th, the Biden administration has expedited the provision of U.S. military and security assistance to Israel. As of late January 2024, one report indicated that since October 7th, the United States has dispatched 280 transport planes and 40 ships to deliver 25,000 tons of armaments and equipment to Israel. The same report noted that due to global shortages in certain types of armaments, the Israeli government had postponed certain defense export contracts in order to redirect resources for domestic combat operations. Emergency arms sale to Israel. In December, the Biden administration notified Congress of proposed sales to Israel of tank cartridges, $106.5 million on December 8th, and artillery shells, $147.5 million on December 29th. In both instances, the administration said it was invoking emergency authorities codified in the Arms Export Control Act, 22 U.S.C. 2776. That allow the president to waive congressional review of an arms sale if the president states in a formal notification to Congress that, quote, an emergency exists, end quote, requiring an immediate sale, quote, in the national security interests of the United States, end quote. According to the Department of Defense, DoD, both sales will be from U.S. Army inventory or U.S. Army stock. A possible reference to the U.S. maintained stockpile in Israel, known as War Reserve Stocks for Allies, Israel, WRSA-I. Amendments to the authorization of WRSA-I in a Senate-introduced version of the Supplemental Appropriations Bill for Israel, see below, would waive congressional notification of sales to Israel from WRSA-I by replacing 30-day congressional notification with, quote, or as far in advance of such transfer as is practicable as determined by the President on a case-by-case basis during extraordinary circumstances impacting the national security of the United States, end quote. The House version of a supplemental appropriations bill would shorten congressional review to 15 days. Several members of Congress have objected to the administration's use of emergency authority to bypass congressional review. Possible new U.S. sales of combat aircraft to Israel. In January 2024, sources reported that the United States and Israel are in the process of finalizing up to 3 different sales of fixed-wing, 25 F-35Is and 25 F-15IAs, and rotary-wing aircraft, 12 Apache helicopters, to Israel. While the delivery of such items are likely years away, reports also note that Israel has been, quote, accelerating acquisition of various kinds of aerial munitions, end quote, worth, quote, hundreds of millions of dollars, end quote. Humanitarian assistance for Palestinians. During President Biden's October 18th visit to Israel, he announced $100 million in U.S. humanitarian assistance for Gaza and the West Bank to, quote, help support over 1 million displaced and conflict-affected people with clean water, food, hygiene support, medical care, and other essential needs, end quote, via, quote, trusted partners including UN agencies and international NGOs, end quote. According to the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, for fiscal year 2024, as of mid-January, USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance had committed $43.3 million in assistance for Gaza and the West Bank, and the Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration had committed $51 million for Gaza and the West Bank via the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, and $18.2 million for the region via another implementing partner. The Department of State has announced a temporary pause in unobligated U.S. funding to UNRWA pending further review of allegations that 12 UNRWA employees were involved in the October 7th attacks. Some lawmakers have sponsored legislation or written letters calling for a halt to humanitarian aid in Gaza and/or greater monitoring of whether or not any U.S. assistance to Gaza and the West Bank may previously have been diverted or be at risk of future diversion by Hamas or other groups. Other lawmakers have called for additional humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. Also, lawmakers are debating the extent to which UNRWA or alternative implementing partners can provide humanitarian assistance while limiting the risks of misconduct. Supplemental appropriations legislation. In an October 19th Oval Office speech, President Biden announced an emergency supplemental budget request to support U.S. partners, including Ukraine, Israel, and others, and address other domestic and global issues. In sum, the president seeks over $14 billion in Israel-related funding. For over 3 months, the House and Senate have considered respective versions of supplemental appropriations legislation, focused not just on Israel, but other foreign policy and domestic matters as well, such as assistance to Ukraine and Taiwan in reforming U.S. border and tax policies. In early February 2024, leadership in both the House and Senate announced revised supplemental appropriations legislation. On February 3rd, House leaders released a base text, House Resolution 7217, which would provide the full amount requested by the president, with additional defense funds for artillery and munitions, while adding $2.5 billion in fiscal year presidential drawdown authority, 22 U.S. Code 2318A1, for Israel, which, quote, shall not take effect, end quote, unless the Secretary of State determines and reports to Congress that the exercise of such authority is in response to the situation in Israel. The bill also would provide $3.3 billion in defense funds to the Department of Defense, DoD, for ongoing operations in the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, area of operations. President Biden has said he would veto the standalone Israel aid bill. A day later, Senate leaders introduced a revised bill. The original Senate supplemental had been introduced in early December as Senate Amendment 1371 to House Resolution 815, appropriating a total of $118.3 billion for a range of foreign and domestic issues. The bill has been introduced as a new substitute amendment to House Resolution 815. Among other things, this bill would provide $14.1 billion in Israel-related supplemental appropriations, including $4.4 billion for DoD's response to the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza and related expenses, $801.4 million for U.S. Army ammunition procurement to respond to the situation in Israel, $4 billion in DoD funding for Iron Dome and David's Sling defense systems, $3.5 billion in foreign military financing, FMF, $769.3 million of which is specified for offshore procurement, OSP, though that figure, quote, may be exceeded if agreed by the United States and Israel following consultation with the Committees on Appropriations, end quote. The Senate bill would also authorize the Secretary of State to waive congressional notification on the foreign military financing funds provided in the bill, quote, if the Secretary of State determines that to do so is in the national security interest of the United States, end quote. $1.2 billion in DoD funding for the Iron Beam laser-based defense system being developed by Israel, and $100 million to the Department of State for worldwide security protection and the response to the situation in Israel. In addition, the revised Senate bill, like its House counterpart in the President's request, also includes proposed provisions that would amend the Department of Defense Appropriations Act 2005, Public Law 108-287, Section 12001, to permit the transfer of previously prohibited categories of defense articles to the government of Israel, and temporarily waive limitations on the total value of defense stockpiles located in Israel and set aside for Israel's use per 22 United States Code Section 2321H(b). As previously mentioned, the House bill would shorten the congressional review period for such transfers to 15 days. The Senate-introduced bill specifies that congressional review take place, quote, as far in advance of such transfer as is practicable as determined by the President on a case-by-case basis during extraordinary circumstances impacting the national security of the United States, end quote. There are several other differences between the House and Senate-introduced Israel-related supplemental appropriations bills. The Senate bill authorizes $7.8 billion in presidential drawdown authority for fiscal year 2024 without specifying a foreign recipient. In addition to providing Israel-related funds, the Senate-introduced bill would match the President's request by appropriating over $9 billion via global humanitarian accounts that could be partly allocated to address the needs of those affected by the crisis in Gaza and Israel, including in neighboring countries, $5.65 billion in international disaster assistance, IDA, and $3.495 billion in migration and refugee assistance, MRA. The House bill does not include these funds. The House-introduced bill would mandate a report describing all security assistance provided to Israel since the October 7th attacks. The Senate-introduced bill would not. The Senate-introduced bill includes $85 million in additional appropriations for other entities, including $75 million in International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement, INCLE, funding for assistance to the Middle East, and $10 million in peacekeeping operations, PKO, for a U.S. contribution to the multinational force and observers mission in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula to enhance force protection capabilities. Finally, the Senate-introduced bill would provide $2.44 billion to replace combat expenditures for weapons in the Red Sea and CENTCOM's other areas of operations. Since the Senate-introduced bill includes global humanitarian assistance funds, some of which may be used to support the Palestinians, appropriators added new restrictions in the February 2024 revised bill explicitly prohibiting funds, notwithstanding any other provision of law appropriated in the bill and prior acts, for contributions to UNRWA. The bill also requires the Secretary of State to certify and report to Congress, no later than March 1, 2024, on U.S. oversight policies and procedures for monitoring assistance in Gaza. Possible Senate amendments to the Supplemental Appropriations Bill for Israel. Since the initial release of the Senate Draft Supplemental Appropriations Bill in December 2023, several senators have announced amendments, some of which may be reintroduced as the Senate considers its latest bill. On December 7th, 13 senators, currently 18 co-sponsors, published a discussion draft of an amendment to House Resolution 815 that would 1. Require that weapons received by any country under this bill are used in accordance with U.S. law, international humanitarian law, and the law of armed conflict. 2. Require that per existing law, Section 620IA of the Foreign Assistance Act, the President obtain assurances that any country receiving weapons via this bill cooperate fully with U.S.-supported efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to those in need. And 3. Require that the President report to the Congress within 30 days on whether each country receiving U.S. security assistance through this bill is, among other things, using U.S.-funded military equipment in accordance with their intended purposes. In January 2024, Senator Tim Kaine announced that he had filed an amendment to, quote, strike a provision in the proposed National Security Supplemental Funding Bill that waives oversight requirements for U.S. funding for Israel under the Foreign Military Financing Program, end quote. Senator Schatz also has announced that he is planning to file an amendment with 48 co-sponsors, reaffirming U.S. support for a, quote, negotiated, comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict resulting in two states with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace, security, dignity, and mutual recognition." End quote. End of section 2. Read by Elsie Selwyn.